After 21 years of service, I had the privilege of being appointed the president of the bank. And today, after 31 years, I stand before you to deliver remarks for the last time as president of the bank. You will agree with me, Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, that it has been a remarkable journey. When I joined the bank, I knew that I was not joining just another financial institution. I was becoming part of a movement aimed at turning decades-old aspirations of Africans into reality. Although I wasn't the most experienced when I came on board, I took up my responsibilities with great enthusiasm, eager to learn, in full belief that fate had placed me, the bank, and the continent on this path together. Upon assuming office as president of the bank in September 2015, I outlined an agenda for my presidency. At that time, it seemed quite ambitious, even an overreach for many. However, given the significant challenges facing our continent, including the resurgence of the commodity crisis reminiscent of the 1980s, a waning hope for industrial transformation, and regression in trade and economic integration, I thought that we could not afford to be lethargic. I was convinced that after 21 years of solid operations, it was time for the bank to more robustly take on the key purposes of its establishment. I thought that the bank had become of age to begin to ask important questions. This will require being bold and courageous in crafting a comprehensive trade development vision and strategy to constructively disrupt the status quo as a prerequisite to achieving Africa's development. We need that for structural transformation to occur, incumbents must fall. But you also knew that incumbents would not fall easily. So if we chose to engage, we must have the courage to fight. We must have the determination, skills, and patience to see that fight through. Our philosophy was born out of conviction that the only viable path forward for Africa's development and economic emancipation was one that would aggressively reverse engineer the colonial strategy of divide and rule and divide and conquer that had for decades pinned Africa and people of African descent down in the dustbin of despair and desperation. Accordingly, our philosophy was that Africa's development dynamo must be powered from within, as hundreds of years of history had shown us that external interests had been mostly predatory and parasitic, unless engaged from a position of strength and purpose. That was why we made the promotion of intra-African trade and investments the arrowhead of our strategy. When we announced that strategy in 2016, many who did not understand the nature and scope of what needed fixing accused us of taking on too many things. and some predicted colossal failure. It has good strategists who spent enormous amounts of time debating ideas, a culture that was handed over to us by the pioneer president, Mr. Dodu. We always knew that our choices were comprehensive and internally consistent. We knew that we had to fight on all fronts, as intra-African trade promotion was until then only a subject of nostalgia with no action. To those who argued that we should focus on trade finance only, I hope they now have their answers as to why that would have failed. And I ask, what trade would have been financed if there were no capacity to produce the goods that will enter the trade? Who would have traded in volumes to merit trade finance if we did not address the institutional failure caused by the absence of export trading companies, which drove the rampant informal intra-African trade? What trade would have been financed if there were no harmonized standards and if there were no testing and certification infrastructure that would reduce the very high non-tariff barriers that block intra-regional trade? Who will venture into intra-African trade if there was no trade information? No trader trades in the dark. Who have committed to deliver goods across African borders when there was very limited infrastructure to carry the goods? How could trade volumes rise to warrant trade financing when the poor intra-African and high extra-African trade compete for the same US dollars? Why would any trader bother to move goods across African borders when at each of Africa's 110 borders, transit guarantees have to be posted before the goods can cross? Which African supplier will have accepted a letter of credit opened by another African bank when there were no international banks to add confirmation to the letters of credit? How would intra-African trade in creative and cultural goods have occurred if there was no one promoting them? How would intra-African trade amongst Africans in Africa, the Caribbean, and the wider diaspora have occurred if there was no deliberate effort to push them? Need I explain any further why we had to fight on all fronts? Your Excellency, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted that because we fought on all fronts, we can point to tangible differences the bank has made. We can now point to those things that now exist, those new institutional arrangements and interventions that have now joined as formidable forces in Africa's armory in its fight towards true self-determination. Those things that we look up to today, many of which were mere hopes and aspirations 10 years ago. For instance, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement implementation is ahead of schedule, thanks, as you've heard from the Secretary General, to Afreximbank support. The Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, which is backed by Afreximbank's $3 billion clearing and settlement facility, is today operational in 20 countries and counting. After more than 60 years of political independence, we are finally on the verge of integrating the continent's 42 payment systems into a single payment rail. And finally, we have made African currencies legal tenders across African borders. The FCFT Adjustment Fund, aimed at supporting FCFTA participating states to adjust in an orderly manner to the new trading regime, is today a reality, thanks to the partnership between the FCFTA Secretariat and the Afreximbank, as well as the bank's $1 billion commitment to support the fund. We are addressing the lack of trade information by launching and implementing the Intra-African Trade Fair, which has held 4 times so far, attracting over $170 billion in trade and investment deals and 180,000 visitors. Our digital platform, the Africa Trade Gateway, uses digital technology to break down information barriers, while our Afreximbank Africa Trade Centers, which have sprung up across the continent, provide solid platforms for intra-African trade and investment information. About 700 standards for pharmaceuticals and medical equipment, agriculture, automobiles, textiles, and so on have been harmonized, enabling smoother intra-African trade. We are building testing and certification centers across Africa to ensure that there is infrastructure to implement the standards we have helped to harmonize. Working with the AFCFTA Secretariat and COMESA, we have launched the Africa Collaborative Transit Guarantee Scheme, supported by $1 billion in guarantee limits from Afreximbank. So today, and one day, it will be possible for goods to move from Cape to Cairo with just one transit bond. With Afreximbank's support, industrial parks and special economic zones are springing up like mushrooms across Africa, creating manufactured exports where none existed. We have worked with Arise integrated industrial platforms to build out industrial parks, helping to process goods that used to leave Africa as mere commodities. We have supported the emergence of heavy industries, such as the Dangote refinery and petrochemical plant, which are exporting not only within Africa, but internationally. Thanks to our work in the past few years, social, cultural, and economic ties with the CARICOM and the broader Africa diaspora have been ignited. Through our Africa Medical Center of Excellence, we have paved the way for quality healthcare to become accessible to many Africans. Getting proper healthcare will soon be a right and no longer a privilege on the continent. At the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, when Africa was left to fend for itself, we rose to the challenge, disbursing over $10 billion in the COVID-19 containment intervention. We also put up $2 billion that enabled Africa and the Caribbean to procure the COVID-19 vaccines when nobody was there to support Africa. Sometimes I wonder what the African Union would have done if there was no Afreximbank. While doing all of this, we still kept a sharp focus on institutional strength and financial health, and grew the balance sheet and guarantees almost eightfold, from $6 billion in September 2015 to almost $44 billion in September 2025. We grew revenues and net income equally and paid out an aggregate of almost $1.4 billion to shareholders as dividends for the same period. So investing in the bank yields two types of dividends: the development dividend we all want, and the dividends that those who invest can put in their pockets. Notwithstanding the foregoing highlights, I do not need to reiterate the eloquent presentations made by my current and former colleagues and the esteemed guest speakers throughout the day. Those presentations, along with the report card I presented at the 32nd annual meetings in Abuja last June, summarize our collective progress and achievements over the last 3 decades, particularly in the past 10 years. We could not have accomplished any of these without the extraordinary support from many of you that are here today, and even those who are not here, who are from different places. Your support has been instrumental in elevating the bank to the current stature. The key purpose of my speech this evening is therefore to say thank you to you all for giving me immense opportunities, tolerating my weaknesses, giving me the benefit of the doubt, and helping me to rise to my full potential.